fine? Okay. Oh, in that case, hello to everybody here. Um, as you can see here, I will talk a little bit about local publishing and some projects I have been involved with, which are, I would say, an experimentation on how we can rethink publishing a little bit, or at least I, for my practice, rethought publishing with successes and also lots of failures. But those failures were in many ways, I would say, big learning curves, and also led me to some of the things I will show you now. Just as a sort of brief introduction, how I came to doing what I'm doing right now. One of the first sort of major researches I worked on was in Afghanistan on a type of photography, on a practice of photography with my colleague Sean Foley, which we called Afghan box cameras. It's basically a box that is camera and darkroom in one, which is sort of a technique that developed in the 10s and 20s in the US and Europe and stayed on in countries that had less accessibility to technology. And so also in Afghanistan. So these cameras were still available in Afghanistan. There were still photographers working on the street in the early 2000s. And I, as at that time, a young photographer and documentarian, made this research project with films and lots of films, and sort of made an online archive of this practice, which is fascinating in itself. But that will be another talk. And we made sort of a first archive approach also on how to talk about the practices, but also the archives. And it all turned into this sort of multimedia platform with many films. And then in the very end, it was nice that we got a publishing deal with a pretty good publisher, which for me as a photographer at that time was like the ultimate goal. You make a great photo book with a publisher that has a big name. At least for me, it was a big name. It was Dowie Lewis. It's a publisher in the UK. Works a lot of documentary photography. And so we turned this large-scale research project, which had hundreds and hundreds or thousands of photos and stories and people, into this one concise sort of book. And which at the time I was very happy. It was beautifully printed, the Italy fine print, so on and so on. And we brought it back to some of the photographers, as you can see here, and this was great. Until I realized I made a fatal mistake. And the fatal mistake is, of course, that nobody in Afghanistan will ever be able to read this book, have access to their own history if they only speak Pashto or Dari, because, of course, our website is also only in English. And this book, of course, is also only in English, and it costs €45, dollar, pound, whatever, and it will never make its way back, except for my suitcase, to Afghanistan. And that, for me, once I realized that, it sort of reduced this whole euphoria we had with international exhibitions and, pats on the shoulder, good work, into something really problematic. And I had to really rethink, okay, now I'm at this turning point. I did something and I realized something is really wrong. I was in my late 20s and I'm thinking, okay, how can I fix this, at least in the future? So I asked myself a couple of key questions. And as I was also more and more interested in not only photographing myself, but working with archives, which sort of happened automatically with this project, the Afghan Box Camera project, because we archived all these materials from these photographers. I was thinking, okay, if I investigate more in countries that are affected by conflict, like Afghanistan is, and I was already working in parts of Pakistan and parts of northern India, and then I shifted also to Myanmar, to Burma. I asked myself, okay, how can I have this interest I have in making books, in publishing, in communicating through print, but more on a local level? And so the project I will talk the most about is the Myanmar Photo Archive, which came out sort of an accidental project in 2011. I went the first time to Myanmar. So Myanmar was under military rule from 1962. There was a coup. And until 2011, there were different forms of military regime in place, and by 2011, 12, 13, the country opened up and had a partly democratic system in place. And that was the time when I went there the first time, and I wanted to see if there's any archives available, any photo book culture, any sort of printing environments, what's it like? And I soon realized there was pretty much nothing back then. Also no visual archives. And so I started to just collect and investigate and collect materials and created an archive. It's just happened. So within 2-3 years, we had 10, 20,000 photographs. We had a lot of local connections with photographers, photo studios, image makers, researchers, and we're thinking, okay, we have to do something, because the local visual representation of the past was very much colonial. So these images that were very, very widely spread. Some of you have maybe seen these types of photographs. They existed also in other countries, these kind of colonial types, the representation of the Burmese beauty, the Shan man, the hunter, so on and so on. And these were the photographs that circulated very, very widely, also in Myanmar, when people thought about their own past. And so, as we started this archive, we had more and more interesting photographs, but we didn't really know what they were, of course, because there was no research that was done before. So it was all sort of field work and talking to a lot of people. And in 2016 or 17, I sort of had a really interesting body of work at my hands that was these fashion photographs, as you can see here, of people in also very 70s clothing. These are all from the late 70s. And I didn't really know what they were, because they were not made for industry. They were made for private purposes, but in the beginning I didn't know for what private purposes. So we interviewed a lot of people who were young at the time, and they told us that it was quite common practice to take a fashion magazine to the tailor, because miniskirts wasn't really okay in public. There was quite a restriction, a social restriction in terms of what you wear on the outside. And so people would go to tailors, get their nice flared trousers and miniskirts tailored, and then go to the photo studio, get themselves photographed, and these photos would then be exchanged. So it was an exchange. It was using the photo studio as a place of becoming, turning into something else or an aspiration, and then these aspirations were exchanged with others, which I thought was an incredible practice that people didn't really know about, because of course, there are no archives, there are no references to visual history at all. And so with my Burmese colleagues, we said, okay, we have to put that into an exhibition. And there was a small festival that used to be held in the French embassy and was for the first time allowed to do something in public. So for the first time we could do an exhibition in a public park, in Mahabadullah Park in the center of Yangon. And so we installed these over life-sized images from that series. And it was just fascinating to see how everybody knew these images, because everybody had an auntie, a mom, a dad, who had one image like that. But nobody knew that that's a practice, because again, there's no visual culture representation anywhere, so you don't know what other people do, you just know what people do within your own intimate circle. And that was incredible, because in a country where you have so much ethnical tensions and divides, people of course always focus on the things that are different, not on the things that are common, the commonalities. And these simple photographs we had of Sino-Burmese and Indian Burmese and Kachin and Karen and Shan and people in these photographs, and everybody had a relation to that, was fascinating to see how people came together. So that was our first exhibition locally with these materials. And I didn't dare yet to make anything print. I wasn't quite ready yet on how to do that with this idea of doing it locally. But I started with the next exhibition, which we did a year later, where the materials we started to have were enormous, 30,000 images. We had lots of people involved to do research on the structure of the local history, because again, there's not a single local photography book on the local photographic history after colonial period. So there's nothing we could base our research on. Everything is fieldwork. Everything is part imagination. You don't know if what you say is actually true. Everything is sort of in limbo. And this was our first exhibition in a colonial building that was closed for 50 years, the Secretariat, which we took over. And within 3 weeks, we had about 50,000 visitors, as this was the first exhibition on local photographic history, and people were extremely hungry for just, their own culture. And I always say there's always lots of people involved from Myanmar. We have different researchers. Depending on the funding that I generate, I can employ people. My role is a bit as a European, to get funds from European institutes and then funnel it into Myanmar, as I can do that. And through that exhibition, we then also made a first book, which is this one here, in Burmese only. So that's one of the first larger photographic books printed locally, that sort of structures the local photographic history. But it was only for the local market. And we sold them, I think we sold that for production price was maybe $6 or $7 euro. And the first 1,000 went in a week. And by now we sold about 5,000 of them. I always give numbers because people in the publishing world know that 5,000 copies of a book is a large number. And when I say tell people I'm printing in Myanmar and we're selling there, people are like, yeah, can you sell anything there? Yeah, you can. We sold more than 20,000 books there so far with the different publications we made. Because it's a question of price and accessibility and also subjects that interest people. But this book, as I said, was only for the local market because the quality of the make, the paper, I just used sort of the standard things that they used anyway. And I knew that I could not really sell that in an outside market. So for me, I was then thinking, okay, with this idea that of course I want to sell and bring these stories also to Europe and the US and communicate this incredible wealth of image making from Myanmar, I started to investigate more into local printing. So this is, I'm not sure if this video will work. No, it doesn't work. Ah, yeah, it works. That's our print shop. It's very old Japanese print machines that work wonderfully. They still make the plates by hand, and all the books we make are made in this very, very simple workshop. And then we did a lot of tests with just different papers, different materials. We also found a very good embosser who has this wonderful machine from 1942 that makes beautiful gold embossing. And then we started to do workshops with binders because there are no binding machines in the whole country. There's glue binding, but there's no thread binding. So, of course, I wanted something that will last. So we started to do workshops on step binding because it's a very simple technique, doing Coptic bindings, and you can make very, very beautiful objects. So after a year, we had the first couple of books with different sort of narratives coming out of the archive. This is on colonial postcards and rethinking and reinterpreting colonial postcards. And we started to sell them locally for, I think at that time, production price was maybe $3. So the books were $3 or $4. And again, this is a very accessible price locally. So we also could sell hundreds of them and make exhibitions with it. And that's the book we made then from this fashion series I showed you, where we made the first exhibition, which we used tracing paper, because I loved the idea that it was an exchange, these photographs, and the tracing paper has that feeling of exchange, sort of in between. And we used the tracing paper that is used for bookkeeping processes usually. So it's like I don't know how, but they used that, and in the end we tested it, and it worked really well. And that was the first book we then also put into book competitions, and we won some prize, and of course this comes out of this workshop in Yangon that now is sold worldwide, and you can get it at Printed Matter, I think for, I don't know how much it is there, $50 or something like that. So, and it comes out of this small, tiny workshop in Yangon. And so of course we have this printer now who's extremely proud and has all these photos of his book being in different shops around the world. And that was the idea, to rethink materiality, local materiality, to have these books available there. So again, this is about $5 there versus $50 in the US. That's adapted to what it should be. But I could never do that reverse, of course. I could never produce that in Italy and sell it for $50, because by the time it's back in Yangon, I also have to sell it probably for $35 or $40. And that was sort of the start of this journey, because then we had more and more materials come to us. For example, there was this wonderful lady who came to one of our exhibitions and said, "Why is my father not in this exhibition?" We said, "Who's your father?" He's like, "He was the #1 photographer, amateur photographer." Okay, and she brought us all these materials, and they were really fantastic. And in the end, so we made a book with all these images of her father, or the images the father took, and also an exhibition, again in the public park. So there was a real dynamic starting, because we made these objects, these local objects, where people really were like, okay, wow, these are locally made. We can produce something like that here in Yangon. And we started to do workshops with young photographers, who then also understood that you don't have to now print this in Europe, as it was sort of the spirit before. We can make it locally. And out of these workshops also, books came out of that with photographers that brought projects to us. This is of the late Bebe, who recently passed. This was a project about her alcoholism and how she processed it in images, which was fantastic, and we used it then to talk about alcoholism in Myanmar, but again through a book object. And so these materials that we use, like the cardboard you see here all the time, this is actually a packaging material that they usually use for packaging. We just reversed it. This is a very, very cheap material. These papers, which you can touch them later, they're quite nice, very thin. This is actually used for when you buy a second-hand copy machine, and they print the manual and how it works. They print it on this paper because it's the cheapest of the cheapest. But it prints really nicely. And so with these very cheap materials, we were just creating nice objects that kept us going and pushing. And in these exhibitions, we would also start digitization stations, so people could come and digitize materials that then go to the archive or not, depending on how they want it. And through these digitization stations, we then got to know more photographers. They would then donate materials to us. So this is the one I showed here. This is a photographer from Taungji, which is in the center north of Myanmar, in Shan State, with very diverse place, culturally diverse, religiously very diverse, because you have different forms of Buddhism there, Hinduism, you have Christianity there. And this photographer documented that for more than 20 years, and has a super archive, and we put that into the book. So there was a really good dynamic locally until COVID. COVID would have been okay, but then the military took over again. So in 2021, there was another military coup with an enormous resistance, which the military did not expect. And since then, it's been really, like a very strong clamping down on any cultural activity. And of course, also a lot of people left because it's been so difficult. But that's even more reason to work culturally there, and I think invest into a cultural environment. So I was lucky to get a very large grant for 2 years from the Goethe Institute. So we employed a whole team of people for 2 years and made sort of small, more educational program also. For example, we made a small book on hand coloring. I love hand coloring. I have a very large collection of old school hand coloring photos, also for Myanmar. So we made a book and sort of educational programs on how to do it yourself. It's a very soft program, but it's sort of to give people also different things to do in these difficult times. And thanks to the Goethe Institute, we had a large budget where we could commission now artists to use our archive. Because by now the archive is very large, but a lot of the materials are unknown in terms of we have no context to them. So context giving obviously needs an enormous brain power, it needs enormous investment in time and finances. And so we had 45 artists, writers, filmmakers, painters, photographers working with the archive on different interpretations. And then that's great, interesting things came out, but the real challenge afterwards was, how do we now communicate that in a fully repressed environment? With, well, some of the topics we couldn't really even show because it was just too much. So me, as a person who works with printed matter, publishing, was thinking, okay, how can we now have this very diverse range of materials put into a publishing practice? And we were thinking about a newspaper, because currently in Myanmar, as in many countries that have gone through that kind of oppression, the newspaper is fully state-controlled. So there's no more free newspaper, and actually nobody reads the newspaper. So we were just thinking, the newspaper in itself is such an incredible medium, because everybody understands that and has that word news also in his head. So we created an exhibition and a newspaper that was called Rethink, in Burmese and English, where basically we brought the news from Myanmar, and we used that medium, reappropriated this medium of the newspaper, because it's a public medium, it's for the people. And in the newspaper you have sort of these interpretations of history printed in the newspaper. So it's from historic materials to really interest in archive, in fashion, in cultural and social issues, so on and so on. So we printed these in 2 languages also. Because that's a big part of my publishing. It's always bilingual accessibility. And out of that, sort of at the very end of these 2 years, where we had quite a bit of budget, we also made a small photo festival, quite underground, and I invited other programs to join us to sort of talk about different issues through archive materials, because that's sort of still very low key, that the government doesn't usually get, and that's sort of how we have to operate. And we made different exhibitions. We also made exhibitions outside of Yangon. This one is in Chiang Mai for the sort of the diaspora. Oh, it's with sound. I don't want sound. 1 second. Here we go. Perfect. Sort of. This was, as I said, in Thailand. So because a lot of the artists have moved out of Yangon, and Thailand, the neighboring country, is housing a lot of the sort of intellectual artist diaspora community. So we just made a lot of different exhibitions with that. Also brought it further out. The next step was, let's see if that skips now. Next slide. Whoop. The next step was Singapore. We brought it also to Singapore, where there's a very large diaspora community as well, actually huge. And there's a small little Myanmar, and we brought the news from Myanmar basically now to the diaspora community in Singapore. And that's sort of, because so many people have left that would actually be, I would say, interested in the kind of work we've been doing, we're now focusing our work also on these diaspora communities. So that was in Singapore during the Singapore Photo Festival, and the next one we're doing is in India with a chain of Burmese restaurants, where we sort of curate an exhibition that travels through this chain of Burmese restaurants. So that was just a transformation of rethinking different medias, and how the media in itself actually becomes a political act, which was really interesting for me to how I never wanted to make a newspaper. It just happened. And the last book we just released is took us also a little bit of time, because we wanted to make something very political that talks in a way directly about the people lost in the struggle against the military takeover, and there were many lives lost, including one of my assistants. And so we made a book with archive footage, archive photos of different funeral ceremonies from different communities. So there are funeral photos in here from Christian community, different Buddhist communities, Hindu funerals. And we combined them with obituaries in the front of names of people who passed during the resistance. And yeah, that's something we can do sort of under the radar, because I don't think the government will get what we're talking about here. So that's the last book we put out. I'm also very proud because it's very beautiful, and it's the first book ever made, black paper, silver ink, locally. So yeah, these are our little technical successes we also have there by pushing the printers, by introducing new ideas, and then having a beautiful product again that is sold globally, coming out of my mini print shop in Yangon. So that's sort of the examples we worked on in Myanmar. The project is still going on. We still have more books coming up. The next book is an attempt to try and put this book into an international book, but also printed in Myanmar, where we will have all the technical information from here, the historic information, but we're also creating another thread that is all about how are we creating archives. And it's sort of a very transparent narrative on how we came to create the Myanmar Photo Archive, with all the problems of appropriation, of a foreigner working there, of there's 1,000 issues we're still having, and we're openly addressing them as one of the narratives in this book. So that's sort of the elements from the Myanmar Photo Archive. And I'm not there full time. I also work on other projects and other researches, and I've been in the last sort of 10 years been trying to implement the same principles also with other books and in other regions that have complete different troubles. So I do work quite a bit in Afghanistan and in Pakistan and in India, and so each region has its own specificity in problems. Versus in Myanmar, where we have issues with certain technological issues, or there are no photo books, but people are very literate and people read a lot and people love literature books, and so there's a huge distribution network of literature, and we tapped into that. So we have literature distributors who distribute our photo books. So that was in that sense quite easy. In Afghanistan, that's very different. So in Afghanistan, we have complete different problems in terms of distribution, or in Pakistan or so on. But just as a few other examples that we sort of worked over the years on to create local content, local stories, create a local industry, because that's a big part of the project is, of course, that the money we spend in printing always stays in the country. It fosters new technologies and new innovations, and in the end, we can sell it there, and so on, as I already explained. This one is a small project from Turkey. It's a tiny archive I found of a couple that in the 1960s and 70s went to all the good restaurants in Istanbul, and all the restaurants, they had photo service. So there was a staff photographer in all the good restaurants, and they would take a picture of you and then quickly go into the dark room in the basement and develop it quickly. And by the time you had the dinner, kaboom, you would get a beautiful designed folder and your photograph. So this was a practice, beautiful practice, not only in Turkey, but all around the Middle East, actually. And I found this life of this couple, and in the end I decided to make this book. And we printed it in Turkey, and we also published it and distributed it in Turkey. And it was beautiful to see that these small kind of historic stories, that everybody has a connection, because everybody in his private archive has something like this, connects again this book to your own history and validates your own history. And that's a lot of the things I'm doing with Fraglich Publishing, my publishing house, is to create sort of a record of intimate stories that can give people sort of, in a way, value to their own personal history by using these personal stories and bringing them into the public. And so, that was one of these small kind of findings that yet tell us very much about one specific place and time. So Istanbul in the 60s and 70s had this new idea of modernity and the celebration, the drinking, the smoking, the dancing. But this was very in these casinos and so on. But this was very particular to this time. And obviously we have here a record of people living this specific time. Another example is I do a lot of research still on these box cameras, like I said in the beginning, in Afghanistan. I also did it with my colleague Sean Foley in India. And for me, it was also very important to publish this book in India, and because India, of course, has a large audience, has a good printing setup, it's relatively easy there, but it's also co-published with the Al-Qazi Foundation, so a local photographic foundation, so that the book is again available locally for a much, much cheaper price, because who can afford 40 euro in India? And the same for books about Peshawar. This is in Pakistan, where we first made an edition in India, and now we're making a new Pakistan edition. I'm currently investigating a lot of time and effort in Pakistan to do something similar to Myanmar, where we create more of a photo book industry. There are of course photo books, and there's a big scene, but we have a couple of books already at hand that we're going to print in the future. That's very exciting. And the same for other projects in Turkey. This is also on these box cameras where I did the research in Turkey. Again, printed locally there. We have a very good network there, and the price is much lower. But these are sort of, in comparison, smaller projects in comparison to the Myanmar Photo Archive, where, of course, because there was no or hardly any photo book industry before, that little spark that we gave was a lot more important. Versus in other countries, like in Turkey, of course, there's an enormous printing industry. I mean, a big chunk of the photo books you see here are printed in Turkey because they have such excellent printing, so it's very different. But this system obviously doesn't work with all countries. I mean, I've worked also quite a bit in and about China, and some of the books I've made about China, I can't print in China. This is a book on the Cultural Revolution. It's a set of images that I acquired in Chongqing in China some years ago on public shaming ceremonies during the Cultural Revolution, and we tried to co-publish it in China, but that was just not possible, and it's still not possible, and it's also not for sale in China. It's for sale in Taiwan and in Singapore, and was before in Hong Kong. So it's this concept and idea, as much as I would like to, is not always applicable. Yeah, so this was sort of a small, quick browse, I would say, through this practice of mine. There over the years, I mean, there were lots of failures that didn't work, I would say. I mean, some of the books we didn't work very well because we didn't think about context within the exhibitions we did and so on. But especially thinking about Myanmar and how these small initiatives, these small ways of using materials and repurposing materials and giving also pride to the printers and the binders and so on, has actually accelerated the local sort of photo book world in its small way. Is definitely, I would say, one of the achievements that we collectively have worked on. If there's any questions, I'll be very happy to answer. Yeah, please.
You seem to obviously chosen regions and conflict. How did you make that conscious decision?
Yeah, so that's correct. I work primarily in conflict regions. It just came about. I worked first in Afghanistan a lot, and I could see with this first archive about the box cameras how in all these places I worked in, there was such a wealth of culture, but so little preservation. And there were, even within photographic practices, there was such a wealth of photographic practices, but there was just no accessibility. So it was purely out of seeing something, seeing that I could be a mediator in between, because I have accessibility, I have access to funds, I have access to making books and so on. And then one thing led to the other. None of my creative path was planned. I mean, I thought I'm going to be an artist, a photographer or something, and I now take no more photos. It's not necessary for me anymore, because I I so much more work on these archives and find it much more important that I, as this person who has now access to all these materials, facilitates visibility to to these photographs. So I'm still a photographer in the way I engage with photography, the way I see it, but I just don't click anymore, or very rarely. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, I mean, we have so many conflict zones that have more and more, but so many conflict zones also that are, of course, culturally so interesting, and we are at this tipping point where materials get lost, where, I mean, the transition is already over between the analog and the digital. And I could see it when I started to collect materials in 2005, where there was still such an enormous amount of analog materials available, and how little there is available now. And how much has been discarded and thrown away and will never come back. And especially in territories where there is conflict and we don't have archives and we don't have institutions or individuals that actually collect and continue a process, I mean, these histories are gone. And then we only have the top-down history, the history created by those in power. Versus all my practice is a bottom-up history, is trying to talk about stories and histories by the people who lived history. And that's what vernacular photography and these archive images do, to give us an access to how territories have been lived by people. And yeah, so that's why we do a lot of also workshops in how to digitize yourself, and sort of trying to encourage people to take care of analog materials. But in countries where there's A, conflict, or B, a very fast process from one condition to another, which means from conflict into, let's say, a more prosperous period. Whatever is behind, and people just move forward. But at one point, this will be regretted, I'm sure. Yeah, because so many things get lost. Yeah. Well, I'll just do a tiny little part. I mean, there's obviously, by now, a lot more archive projects, and also there are more local printing projects, and which is fantastic. So I think there's been, in the last 10 years, a huge push, a very positive push. But in many places, it's already too late. Yeah, to be honest. Sure. Any other questions? Wider, related, country questions, or? I'm from Austria, but I live in France. But we move, I mean, with the different projects, 8 months per year, because usually I spend a month in Myanmar, and then there's maybe a project in India, and then it's a month there. Because these kind of researches and, of course, the investigation take time and trust. So you can't just rock up and expect everything to happen within a month. So usually it takes years to also build up these things. So I have a lot of these projects I'm working on. It's all side by side. So that's why it's like, okay, I'm maybe a month or two in Myanmar, and then I go for a few weeks to Pakistan, and then. Mm-hmm. This was a very, talking about, yeah, the public exhibitions, this was a very brief period in Myanmar where we had access to the public space, and they allowed us, or at least not forbid us, to do exhibitions in public. This is over now, so this is not possible anymore. But that was amazing because I mean, I love the public space much more. I mean, I do museum exhibitions and gallery exhibitions too. This has its own value, but in places where especially where there's no culture of the museum, creating a museum takes 2 decades to get people to come, and the public, of course, is the public, and so we have been experimenting a lot with the public space, and that's what I will keep doing also with the Myanmar Photo Archive and the way we want to work with the diaspora communities, because what we did in Singapore, for example, it worked so well that, yeah, I'm much more interested in setting up now an exhibition in restaurants than in a museum with this project. Yeah. Sorry, you had a...
Are there any kind of institutional archive or national archive that museums will visit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. If there are any institutional archives. There is a national archive, at least by name. What's in it, nobody knows. So I remember the very first time I went to Myanmar, I wanted to go there, and I had to give specific like briefs on what I want, and I could get 1 image per day, sort of on a floppy disk. Yeah, so it's not. We don't know. We don't know what's there. There is a national archive, but yeah, but I doubt it had anything to do with a consecutive contextualization of history. I mean, I'm sure that there's military archives in there, but who knows? It will one day. I hope it will be an amazing surprise. But there's nothing public and there's nothing accessible. So again, we have to imagine it's a country that has not a single contextualized access to the past. No newspaper has an archive. No university has a picture archive. You can't research on a certain subject when it comes to images. So we started to do this now digitally. We have about 10,000 images digitized on our website. With very rudimentary basic tag function, because that requires a lot of money and programming, which I still have to find again. But yeah, that's the future is digitizing everything, because I don't know where these physical materials will end up in the end. I can't have them in Myanmar deposited, so I have to deposit them somewhere else because they're a bit too heavy on my shoulder. But yeah, that's the future. I don't know yet. Please. Yeah. Yeah, it's a super question. If I see any results in terms of research from the archive. It's locally, actually, because the university structures have been so bad that there's very little inspiration to do academic or historic research the way we might be used to. So there's locally, there are some enthusiastic historians, but I would say the people who work on Myanmar history are usually in diaspora and outside, and might study at a foreign university coming from Myanmar. So we have, of course, engagement with different study centers, and there has been also published partly in this newspaper some interesting research, but by far not enough. So our approach was to foster an engagement was this artistic approach, because we knew it would be easier for us to get artists and sort of creative writers engaged with the archive, versus trying to put money on the table and say, hey, write a research paper, because we knew that would also not happen. So yeah, there's huge constraints, and exactly, I mean, that question really talks so much about the incredible lack of everything in Myanmar. And Myanmar is not the only country with so much lack of so much. Yeah, so sadly, there's not enough research yet done in contextualization. So that's, for me, for the future, also an important part, that this archive gets deposited maybe in a research institute that then can take care of it, and researchers can come and engage with it. Yeah, so challenges. Please, yeah.
How did you choose where you were going to, I mean, I hear you say that you were already engaged in Afghanistan,
Mm-hmm.
and so you began there, but how did you end up in Myanmar?
Yeah,
Is there another, and you said India.
yeah, it's. I mean, I worked a lot regionally. For a long time, I lived in China also, because that was a very good base point, and had a very, it was just a very interesting environment before the 2010s. And it was pure curiosity. That opening up, that all of a sudden the National League of Democracy, this Democratic Party of Aung San Suu Kyi, all of a sudden had a place in the government. This sudden liberty that's wasn't so sudden, but this liberty that all of a sudden was there, and this possible future was just made me really curious, and that's why I went and investigated, and by accident, a friend of mine opened a restaurant there, and all of a sudden there was a social environment, and I was like, oh, that's fantastic, and so yeah, and then it just grew. Yeah, and that's sort of, I think, with most of these practices, because there's no set path for any of these things, neither for the books nor for the production. It just evolved from one thing to the other, as I mean, as life does for most of us, I guess.
Do you feel like there's a, that you could put some kind of parameter on this and say, here's a way, you know, can you expand? Because I think this is fantastic.
Yeah.
What you've done here. Is there a way that you sort of package it and say, here, you guys, other people take on this because you're only one person?
No, absolutely. No, but that is already happening. I mean, we're doing workshops. There are other initiatives that try to do similar things, and I come as facilitator and help set certain infrastructures up, or look at the infrastructures that already exist. Because wherever we go, there's printing, whether you call it poor printing or good printing or something else, but there's always printing, even if there's just a Xerox machine. So yeah, I've done a lot of facilitation workshops and trying to investigate into the local infrastructure and how that infrastructure can then be used to make photo book objects, and how these photo objects then, you know, advise on how they can be used in a community for different purposes. And so now with my publishing project, I don't call it publishing, it's still a project because every book is different. I have photographers approach me mostly with archives. The next one we're doing, one is in Pakistan, then in Mali, Mauritania. So those are the next project where I will also go. And I'm not sure if we print in Mauritania or if we have to cross over to Senegal. This we will see. I haven't been yet, but yeah, where we do exactly that. Local investigation, seeing what's possible, and I keep telling this to people also in these facilitation workshops of sorts, is that whatever you produce locally will be so much more interesting than when you go and print in a nice Italian print shop that creates your perfect book. And I have in my publishing sort of range books where we got money, so we printed it in Europe, and I'm very sad about it. Because I know if you would have printed the same book locally, it would have been much better. Because the materiality would speak about the content, it would speak about what's there. And that perfect book is still great as a reference, but it doesn't in the same way. Yeah, so there's a big part now is definitely encouraging people to try and dig into what's there and use what's there. And yeah, we can push it. I mean, again, if I make this book, I can print this in Europe. The production-wise price will be probably 7 or 8 times higher, and the quality by now what we do in Myanmar is great. And yeah, so it's things that are just possible. It just needs patience and obviously this is not an economic model what we're doing. It's not a business, so that's the luxury of it, I would say. Yeah. Yeah, great. Okay, in that case, thank you very much. And I'm just down here at the A section, A9. You can please come by, look at books. I can tell you more in-depth stories. Super, thank you.